The conference room on the sixth floor of Crossbar Innovations looked like every other conference room in Seattle. Floor-to-ceiling glass, a long table, 12 chairs arranged with the kind of precision that suggested someone had once measured the distances between them. 12 chairs for a leadership team of 11. The extra one sat to the right of the head of the table, slightly apart from the rest, armless, just slightly lower than its neighbors, as though it had been chosen by someone who understood, without being told that sitting down quickly shouldn't require rearranging yourself. A small folded card leaned against its back. The card said reserved, in clean, even handwriting. The chair had been there for 3 years. Nobody sat in it. Nobody asked about it. When new employees made the mistake of pulling it out, scanning the room for an open seat during a crowded all-hands, someone always stepped in quietly to redirect them. And Sloan Hargrove, CEO of Crossbar Innovations, would wheel through the door 5 minutes before every meeting, glance at the chair to confirm it was in its place, and say absolutely nothing. 3 years. Every meeting. One empty seat. If you want to know what unexplained loyalty looks like, start there. If this already has you, tap like and tell me where you're watching from. Sloan Hargrove had built Crossbar Innovations in 7 years, out of a conviction that most companies designing for people with disabilities had never actually talked to one. She'd started in a 2-room suite in Belltown with a whiteboard, a borrowed server rack, and a co-founder named Diana Prell, who could find a structural flaw in a product interface the way certain people spot bad weather, early, accurately, and without needing to be asked. By the time Sloan was 34, Crossbar had 61 employees, a waiting list of government contracts, and a reputation that preceded her everywhere in the Pacific Northwest the way certain weather systems precede themselves. You knew it was coming and you planned accordingly. What they planned for, specifically, was her directness. She called it precision. Her board of directors had used 3 words on record: efficient, demanding, difficult. Her legal team preferred a 4th: thorough. Her leadership team used none of those words, because the truth was that Sloan Hargrove frightened most of them in the specific way that genuinely brilliant people frighten everyone around them. Not through cruelty exactly, but through a relentless accuracy that left nowhere to hide. She could read a balance sheet in the time it took most people to find the page number. She could identify the single assumption in a business proposal that would unravel everything else. She could sit through 40 minutes of a presentation and ask the one question that collapsed the argument, and she would do it without raising her voice, without malice, and without the small social grace of pretending she hadn't just demonstrated that the other person had not thought this through. The wheelchair was 3 years old. The company was 7. She had rebuilt her presence inside the first without dismantling the second, and if you were looking for some transformed sense of purpose in that fact, for a story about rediscovering what matters, you were misreading the room. Sloan had not rebuilt Crossbar in the aftermath of the accident because she'd found new meaning. She had rebuilt it because 61 people's salaries needed someone to run the company, and because the alternative, allowing something she and Diana Prell had built together to dissolve while she was in a rehabilitation facility in Bellevue, was not something she was capable of allowing. That was the entire story. She was not brave. She was not a lesson. She was a CEO doing her job from a different position in the room, and the job was the same as it had always been. The chair to her right with the folded card was the one piece of unexplained territory in an otherwise entirely legible life. Nobody touched it. Nobody asked. This was how institutional memory worked at Crossbar, not through documentation, but through watching what happened to people who broke the unwritten rules and understanding, without having the rule explained, that some things were simply not open for discussion. Nobody knew the handwriting on the card was Sloan's own. Nobody knew that the handwriting it was modeled after, the slight forward tilt, the even spacing, the way the capital R had a specific curve at the bottom, had belonged to Diana Prell, who had spent 7 years writing reserved on napkins, agendas, and scraps of paper torn from meeting pads, saving seats for Sloan at every table she got to first. Nobody knew that. They only knew the chair was there and that you didn't sit in it. The rest of Sloan Hargrove's life could be mapped in clean lines. The accident could not. She did not talk about it. She did not reference it in interviews, in internal communications, or in the single profile piece that a Seattle business publication had run on her the year before, which she had agreed to only because the resulting coverage had brought in 2 significant contracts, and she was not sentimental enough to turn down useful publicity. The reporter had asked about the wheelchair. Sloan had said, spinal cord injury following a car accident 3 years ago. Then she had moved the conversation back to the quarterly numbers, and the reporter, to their credit, had followed. That was the version the world had. Diana Prell was mentioned in one sentence of that profile as a co-founder who had passed away. 3 years had elapsed. The chair was still there. What nobody at Crossbar understood was that Sloan Hargrove was not mourning in private. She had mourned, and she had finished mourning in the way that certain people finish things, completely, deliberately, and without asking anyone to witness it. What remained was not grief. It was something harder to name. A refusal to pretend that the seat hadn't mattered. A refusal to close a door that Diana had spent 7 years opening for her. The chair was not sentimentality. It was precision, which was, to Sloan Hargrove, the highest possible form of respect. Joel Brennan drove to his interview at Crossbar Innovations on a Tuesday in late March, with his daughter's rain boots still in the back seat from the weekend and $43 in his checking account. Not $43 until payday. $43. Total. The savings his wife Claire had set aside, the fund she'd called the floor, the amount they'd promised they'd never go below. He'd burned through it in February when the heating bill came and Maya's winter coat split at the shoulder seam and he'd had to choose. He'd chosen the coat. He was 33 years old. He had a daughter who was 7 and who currently believed with complete sincerity that she could teach their neighbor's cat to recognize color flashcards. He had a facilities management certification, 6 years of operations experience, and a resume his sister had helped him update after Claire died, because he had not been able to look at it himself for a long time. He had all of that, and $43, and a 9 o'clock interview at an accessibility tech company in South Lake Union that he'd found on a job board at midnight. The way you find things when you can't sleep, and the searching part of your brain needs somewhere to go. He had not mentioned Claire in the application. He'd written a version of the cover letter where her work, advocacy and policy in the accessibility space, adjacent to what Crossbar did, was the opening line, the logical through line from her life to this particular job. He'd written it, and then he'd deleted it. He didn't want to be the widower with the dead wife who had worked in the field. He wanted to be the facilities coordinator who was good at the job. Those were different things, and he was tired of being the first thing. He found parking 2 blocks from the building and walked there in the drizzle, wearing the wool jacket that had been Claire's idea. Charcoal, the kind that didn't wrinkle, bought for his birthday 4 years ago. For the times when you need to look like you planned this, she'd said, paying for it before he could object. He wore it to every interview since. He wasn't sure if that was superstition or memory or the absence of a reason not to. Probably some of all three. The interview was with a woman named Patricia Walsh, Sloan's executive assistant, and it lasted 32 minutes. Patricia was careful and efficient and said exactly 3 things that told him what he needed to know about the environment. She said the facilities coordinator role had a faster turnover than we'd like. She said that Sloan Hargrove had very high standards, which she applies consistently. And she said, looking at him with the measured expression of someone who had been wrong about people before and learned from it, the people who do well here are the ones who don't take things personally. What kind of things? Joel had asked. Patricia had considered him for a moment. Most things, she said. He got the job 4 days later. The salary was 18% higher than his last role. He accepted without negotiating, which he regretted for approximately 2 minutes after sending the acceptance email, and then stopped regretting, because he had $43 and a daughter and a coat that didn't wrinkle and you did not negotiate when you had $43. He started on a Monday. He spent that Monday learning the building the way he always learned a new building. Not from the facilities manual, which was inevitably out of date, but from walking every floor, every mechanical room, every storage closet, touching the pipes and looking at the wiring, and understanding where things had been improvised and where they were solid. Most buildings were a palimpsest of whoever had managed them before, written in zip ties and half-finished work orders and cable runs that made sense at the time. Crossbar was no different. Competent bones with accumulated improvisation on top, which meant 6 months of quiet fixes, and nobody would ever know the difference, which was exactly how he preferred to work. He met Sloane Hargrove for the first time on his 3rd day. He was in the server room off the 2nd floor, recataloguing the cable management that his predecessor had apparently addressed by attaching things to other things at random and trusting the universe. He'd been there an hour and was about 30 minutes from having it make sense when the door opened and a woman in a black wheelchair rolled in without knocking, looked at what he was doing and said, "Why did you change the rack configuration?" "Because the old one was pulling power from 2 separate circuits that weren't labeled," Joel said. "If anyone plugged a third load device into the secondary strip, it would have tripped the backup." Silence. "I rerouted everything onto one labeled circuit." "You won't lose the secondary array if someone in accounting is running a space heater." He turned around. Sloane Hargrove was looking at him the way someone looks at a thing that has just surprised them. Not impressed, not warm, but processing. She had dark hair pulled back, and the kind of face that had been making decisions all day and wasn't finished. She was wearing a gray blazer over a white shirt, and her posture in the wheelchair was so deliberately upright that it took him a second to separate it from authority and understand that it simply was authority, that there was no separation to be made. "When did you identify the circuit issue?" she said. "First morning." "Then you fixed it today." "I wanted to understand the whole configuration before I changed anything." She looked at the rack. She looked at him. He had the distinct impression that this was a test, and that he had either passed it or failed it, and that she was not going to tell him which. "The vendor comes Friday," she said. "Make sure what you've done doesn't interfere with their assessment." "It won't," he said. She left. He stood in the server room for a moment. Patricia had told him not to take things personally. He was beginning to understand what kind of personality required that instruction. The next 2 weeks were variations on that exchange. She asked questions that were really assessments. He answered accurately. She never said thank you, never acknowledged completion. She moved to the next thing. He tracked maintenance requests, managed the small operational crises that all companies had, the FAQ on the 3rd floor that had begun making a sound like a question no one wanted to answer, the elevator calibration that had slipped by 4 millimeters and was now catching on one side, the water filtration cartridge that needed a replacement order nobody had gotten around to placing. He handled each of them without ceremony. She noticed in the way people pay attention when they are paying very close attention, not by commenting, but by not asking the same question twice. On his 11th day, he attended his first leadership team meeting. He was there to present the quarterly facilities report, a 4-minute slot at the end of the agenda. He arrived early, because he always arrived early, and found the conference room empty except for the chairs and the long table and the one chair to the right of the head that had the small folded card against its back. Reserved, he looked at it for a moment. It was slightly different from the other chairs, armless, just a hair lower. Someone had chosen it carefully, or someone had always chosen it carefully, for reasons that were not on any paperwork he'd been given. He thought about asking Patricia. He didn't. He set up his report at the far end of the table and waited. When Sloane rolled in, she did exactly what he had now heard described twice in the hallway by 2 separate people who thought they were alone. She glanced at the reserved chair, confirmed it was where it was supposed to be, and said nothing. The leadership team filed in around it with the practiced ease of people who have long ago stopped wondering. Gordon Mass, the CFO, took the seat to her left. The rest arranged themselves. The empty chair remained. Joel's report lasted 4.5 minutes. Sloane asked one question at the end, the one gap in his data, a maintenance cost projection he hadn't broken out by floor. He told her he'd have the number to her by end of day. He did. At 4:47 p.m. he sent the follow-up email. She responded at 5:12 with 2 words. Adequate. Thank you. He stared at that for a while. He thought about Maya, who had made him a good luck card for the new job out of construction paper, with a drawing of what appeared to be either a dragon or an unusually large dog. She had been firm on dragon, so he'd accepted dragon. He thought about the $43 that had grown back to $400 since the first paycheck. He thought about the chair in the conference room with the folded card. He didn't know what any of it meant yet. He only knew that he had not been driven out of this job in 11 days, which was better than his last 3-week stretch at the place before that, and that the woman who ran this company had looked at something he'd fixed and asked him a specific question about it, which was more than most people had done in a long time. He put his phone face down on his desk. He wrote the follow-up to 2 other open work orders. He thought, briefly, about Diana Prell, whose name he'd read in the company history document Patricia had sent him on day 1, co-founder, passed away 3 years ago. He thought about the chair. He thought about how certain absences take up more room than presences. He thought about Claire, and then he stopped thinking about Claire because that was how he survived the afternoons, by knowing exactly when to stop. He went home. He picked up Maya from the after-school program. She showed him the flashcard results. The cat had recognized green twice out of 8 attempts. He told her that was 25%, which was statistically better than chance. She said she knew that. He made pasta. She told him about her day. He told her about the dragon or dog card on his desk at the new job. She corrected him. Dragon. He said obviously. He slept better that night than he had in 3 months. Not well, but better. That was, he had learned, the whole vocabulary of improvement. Not well. Better. What Sloane Hargrove noticed about Joel Brennan in the first month was this: he did not require managing. This was rarer than it should have been. Every hire Sloane made required some form of calibration. The high performers who needed praise to function, the capable ones who needed frequent check-ins, the ambitious ones who needed to be redirected when their ambition outran their mandate. Even the people who ran themselves well needed to be watched, not because they couldn't be trusted, but because trust was a thing you verified, not assumed. She had learned that from Diana, who had put it exactly, you don't distrust people. You just confirm what you already expect to be true. Joel Brennan was consistently what she expected him to be, which was unusual. Most people were better in the interview and worse in the reality. He was the same. He fixed what needed to be fixed before she knew it needed to be fixed. He sent brief, accurate emails. He did not stop her in the hallway to update her on things she hadn't asked about. He did not attempt to build a relationship with her through small talk, which was the thing that made her trust him most, because small talk was almost always the preamble to something people wanted from you. And Joel Brennan, apparently, did not want things from her. He wanted to do the job. He was doing the job. She did not tell him this. She noticed it the way she noticed most things that worked correctly, by not having to think about it, which was the best compliment she knew how to pay. The pace of endurance was not glamorous. It was the same building, every morning, the same entry badge, the same cup of coffee from the break room that was slightly too strong because whoever programmed the machine had calibrated it for people who needed to be awake before they were ready to be awake. Joel had adjusted by adding a splash more water. He had not asked anyone if this was acceptable. It was a coffee machine. He had calibrated it. This was in miniature how he moved through everything at Crossbar. He identified what was off, he made the adjustment, and he did not announce it. The adjustment either worked or it didn't. If it worked, he moved on. If it didn't, he tried something else. The HVAC on the 3rd floor that had been asking the question nobody wanted to answer had turned out to have a belt misalignment in the secondary unit, not the dramatic mechanical failure that the previous facilities manager had apparently scheduled for 6 separate assessment appointments without ever resolving. Joel fixed it in an afternoon, on a Tuesday, while 2 members of the design team had a meeting directly below. Neither of them noticed. That was the point. Sloane noticed. Not by commenting, but by doing what she did with things that worked. She stopped asking about them. In April, she held a staff all-hands meeting that Joel attended in his facilities capacity, standing at the back of the room. She presented the Q1 performance figures with the unadorned precision of someone who believed that numbers, correctly assembled, were the most honest language available. She thanked the team, briefly and without ceremony. Sloane Hargrove's idea of a team celebration was acknowledging that things had gone well before moving on to what still needed doing, which the Crossbar team had apparently decided to interpret as respect rather than coldness, because they trusted her in the particular way you trust someone who has never once told you something was fine when it wasn't. At the end, she asked for facilities questions. One of the designers asked about the temperature on the third floor. Joel answered from the back of the room. Sloan did not turn around when he spoke. But afterward, when the room was clearing and he was the last one still there, gathering the handout that had been left on his chair, she said from the doorway, without looking at him, already leaving, "Good answer." He put the handout in the recycling. He thought about what the 2 words had cost her. He thought that they had cost her nothing, that they were simply accurate, which was how she distributed praise, and that the thing he should take from them was not warmth, but information. He had answered correctly. That was all she was saying. He told himself that. He mostly believed it. The harder days in May were not the ones with Sloan. They were the ones with the calendar. May had Claire's birthday in it. It had the anniversary of the aneurysm diagnosis, which was a different day from the anniversary of her death, a fact that Joel had not anticipated would matter differently and had been wrong about. May also had Maya's spring showcase at school, which Claire had never missed, and Maya had made 2 drawings for the program, one for the program itself, and one that she had put in the mailbox when they got home, for Mom to get it wherever she is. She had explained, in the practical way that 7-year-olds handled the things they couldn't fully understand, but refused to ignore. He had gone inside and stood at the kitchen counter for a while before making dinner. He did not bring any of this to work. He had learned, in 3 years of being the kind of person who was managing something, that you carried it by not making it visible. Not because you were hiding it, but because work was work, and what you brought to it was the quality of your attention. He brought his full attention. He did his job. At the end of the day, he drove home and picked up Maya, and they made dinner, and she showed him whatever she'd made, or learned, or decided was important, and they managed together the way that 2 people manage when they are all they have, and have made a private agreement not to make the other person feel the weight of it. Sloan said nothing about the days when he was quieter. She was not a person who said things about that kind of thing. But once, in late May, when he had arrived 5 minutes later than usual and been slightly less efficient in his morning report, she had simply moved on to the next thing without comment. And later that morning, a message had come from Patricia saying that the parking validation for staff had been updated and that he should use the covered structure going forward, which was a perk that had previously only applied to people at the director level and above. He used it. He did not say anything about it. That was its own kind of language. The texture of Sloane's cruelty, he had learned, was not cruelty at all. It was expectation. She expected things of people, specific things, clearly communicated things, calibrated to what she believed each person was capable of, and she treated falling short of those expectations as information, not as failure, not as disappointment, but as data about the distance between what someone could do and what they were currently doing. She was not trying to wound people with that information. She was simply too impatient with pretense to pretend the gap wasn't there. What made her hard to work for was that most people were not used to being seen that clearly. They were used to environments that offered a certain amount of social cushion between expectation and reality, a space where you could tell yourself that the review had gone fine even when it hadn't quite, where feedback was wrapped in enough acknowledgement of effort that the actual information got softened. Sloan did not provide that cushion. If something had not gone well, she told you so, precisely and without emotional packaging, and then she waited for you to address it. The people who left were the ones who needed the cushion. The ones who stayed had decided, each in their own way, that being seen clearly was worth the discomfort of having nowhere to hide. Joel had never needed the cushion. Not because he was exceptional, but because he had learned. In 33 years, and specifically in the 3 years that had included losing Claire and raising Maya alone and being wrong about things in ways that had real consequences, that pretending things were fine when they weren't was the most efficient way to guarantee they stayed that way. He preferred the information, whatever it cost. This made him, from Sloane's perspective, someone she did not have to manage. And he was beginning to understand that not having to be managed was, for her, the highest possible form of comfort from another person. In June, he started leaving his morning report slightly earlier, by 7:30 instead of 8, so they were waiting when she arrived. He did not tell her he was doing this. He simply did it. 3 days later, she began sending him the day's agenda, alongside her own calendar, which she had never done, which meant he could sequence the facility's work around the building's actual rhythm rather than working around it after the fact. They were, without having agreed to it, organizing around each other. It was not visible to anyone else. It was visible to Joel because he paid attention to systems, and this was a system being built incrementally from both sides, and it worked with the specific quiet efficiency of things that are built by two people who are both very good at their jobs and have stopped pretending the collaboration isn't happening. Patricia Walsh had worked at Crossbar for 4 years, which meant she had worked with Sloane Hargrove for 4 years, which meant she had developed a comprehensive map of the territory that most people found impassable. She knew when Sloane was tired, and what that looked like, a half-second lag before answering questions she would normally answer immediately. She knew when Sloane was managing something difficult, and what that looked like, increase in the precision of her emails, fewer words, not more. She knew that the reserved chair was not her place to ask about, and that the photograph on the windowsill was not her place to ask about, and she had built her professional relationship with Sloane on the foundational principle of excellent work delivered without commentary about things that weren't hers to comment on. She had been watching Joel Brennan since March. She had watched the server room conversation, and the board call comment in the mechanical room, and the morning reports, and the way the building had quietly stopped having the kinds of small failures that accumulated into large ones over time. She had watched Sloane stop asking her to track the facility's status, which meant Sloane was tracking it directly, which meant she trusted the source. In late June, she stopped Joel in the second-floor hallway on his way to the electrical panel. "She's in a trial," Patricia said. He looked at her. Medical? Patricia was giving him information she had decided he needed. This was not a small decision for someone who guarded information as professionally as she did. Nerve regeneration. She started in February. The appointments are Thursday mornings, which is why she's always slightly late to the Thursday check-in. She paused. "I'm telling you because she won't, and because you should know why she sometimes looks like she's listening for something only she can hear." He looked at the electrical panel. He looked back at Patricia. "Okay," he said. Patricia nodded. "The thing with her hand," she said, "when she presses it against the armrest, that's her checking whether the signaling is getting through. It's been getting through more often." She turned back toward her desk. She would tell you this herself if she knew how to do it without making it into something. She doesn't know how to do that yet. A pause. "I thought you should know anyway." He went to the electrical panel. He did his work. He thought about the hand on the armrest and the Thursday appointments and the testing whether the door was there, quality of the gesture, and he thought about a person who was rebuilding something from the inside out, privately, in the specific way of people who will not allow anyone to witness the effort until they can show them the result. He said nothing about it to Sloane. He knew, instinctively and accurately, that saying something would be the worst thing he could do. What you did for people who were doing the hardest thing alone was not make them explain it. You just stayed in the room. He stayed in the room. What she did not notice, or chose not to notice, was that she had begun to organize her mornings slightly differently. She had always reviewed the day's meeting agenda before leaving her apartment. She still did that. But she had also started reading whatever operational update Joel had sent the evening before. She had not asked for these. He sent them anyway. Brief summaries of what had been completed, what was pending, what he'd flagged for the next week. She read them. She did not respond unless there was a question. There rarely was. She told herself she read them because she needed to know the building's status. She told herself this the way you tell yourself things that are mostly true, but not entirely. What was entirely true was that Crossbar Innovations had been running with a maintenance backlog that she had considered low priority for 2 years. And that backlog was now gone. The building worked. The elevators were calibrated. The server room was clean. The air on the third floor no longer asked questions. These were small things. Sloane Hargrove had built a company by understanding that small things, managed correctly, were the entire foundation on which large things stood. She told Gordon Mast that the new coordinator was working out. Gordon said he was glad to hear it. Gordon was always glad when things worked out. He was the kind of man who was glad about things, warm, careful with people, The sort of CFO who remembered birthdays and sent handwritten notes and genuinely believed that a good workplace culture was the engine of a good balance sheet. He had been at Crossbar for 4 years. She had hired him herself, which meant she was responsible for his presence in her life, which she sometimes thought about in the way you think about decisions that were correct in theory and complicated in practice. Gordon was good at his job. He was also, increasingly, worried about her in a way she had not asked him to be. She did not know yet what Gordon was worried about, or what he had begun to do about it. That was coming. The first real crack appeared on a Thursday in April, in the way that first cracks often appear, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a small, unexpected moment that you only recognize as significant after the fact. Joel had been at Crossbar for 6 weeks. He was replacing a water shutoff valve on the 4th floor, a 20-minute job that had turned into 40, because the previous installation had used the wrong fittings and whoever had done it had over-tightened everything, which was the facility's equivalent of someone solving a problem by hitting it harder. He was kneeling on the floor with a wrench when he heard the sound of a wheelchair and looked up to find Sloane in the doorway of the mechanical room, reviewing something on her phone. She didn't acknowledge him. He went back to the valve. "There's a board call in 20 minutes, she said, not looking up. "I'll have this sealed and the water back on in 10, he said. A pause. "That's not why I'm telling you." He looked at her. She was still looking at her phone, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that was different from the usual precision of her posture. Slightly more contained. He'd seen that once before, a week ago, during a tense call with the government contracts office that had pushed back on a delivery timeline. She'd ended the call, sat very still for about 4 seconds, and then pressed her left palm flat against the armrest of her wheelchair with deliberate, even pressure. Not gripping, just pressing, like she was checking whether something was there. Then she'd moved on. He hadn't said anything then. He didn't say anything now. "The board calls used to be Diana's favorite part," Sloane said. "It came out the way things come out, when you haven't meant to say them, but also haven't entirely not meant to say them. Flat, just a fact, offered to the air." He kept working. "Diana was the co-founder," he said. "Yes. Was she good at board calls?" A silence that was different from her usual silences. Less controlled. She was better at them than I was. She thought they were theater, which meant she enjoyed them. I think they're a necessary mechanism, which means I'm thorough but not particularly engaging. A beat. She used to brief me beforehand, every single call, even when I knew the material, even when I'd been the one who prepared the deck. She'd find the one thing I hadn't thought about and hand it to me in a sentence. She called it the gift. Sloane's voice was precisely level. I've given 41 board calls without that. Joel said nothing for a moment. He finished with the valve, checked the seal. "What would she have handed you today?" he asked. Another silence. He wasn't sure she was going to answer. Then that the committee chair is going through a divorce and makes his worst decisions when he's sleep-deprived and distracted, and that I should lead with the revenue trend line before the contract update so he has the good news while he's still paying attention. "That sounds right," Joel said. He turned the water back on. Checked for drips. Found none. "Lead with the revenue trend line." She looked at him. It was the first time she had looked at him, really looked at him, in 6 weeks of working in the same building. He didn't look away, and he didn't make anything of it. He just met her gaze the way you meet someone's gaze when you have not said anything that requires apologizing for. "The valve is done," he said. "You have 12 minutes. She turned and wheeled out. She did not say thank you. But at 3:47 that afternoon, Joel received an email from Patricia Walsh with a subject line that said simply, "The board approved the Q2 contracts." CC'd at the bottom, Sloane Hargrove. He read it twice. He put his phone away. He went back to his work orders. That was the first crack. Not a thaw, not yet. Just the discovery that there was something on the other side of the wall. The weeks that followed were the slow geography of two people who worked in the same space and had begun, without acknowledging it, to organize themselves around each other. Sloane still did not soften. She still sent back reports with corrections instead of thanks, still asked questions that were really assessments, still treated every interaction as a transaction. She fired 2 different vendors in April for deliverables that were 3 days late and 2% over spec, and when the second vendor's account manager called her directly to complain, she listened for 11 seconds and said, "The contract was clear." Then she ended the call. She was who she was. Joel did not expect her to be otherwise. What changed, slowly and almost imperceptibly, was the quality of the silence between them. In the beginning, it had been her silence and his performance, him working, her evaluating. Now it was a different kind. When he entered a room she was in, there was a brief, nearly invisible shift, the way a room's air pressure changes when a door opens. Not warmth, just acknowledgement, which was its own kind of language, in a place where nothing unnecessary was ever said. He began to notice other things. That she ate lunch at her desk at exactly 12:15, the same thing every day. Some kind of grain bowl from a place called Fieldwork 2 blocks away, which she ordered through an app and which was waiting at reception when she came through. That she kept a yellow legal pad on the right side of her desk that she wrote on with a pen, not a stylus, in the same backward-tilted handwriting as the card on the reserved chair. That she had a small framed photograph on the windowsill of her office, turned so that it faced the window, not the room, so that she could see it from her desk but no one standing in her doorway could. He never got close enough to see who was in it. That was the second thing he noticed about the chair, the handwriting. The reserved card, he'd realized after a few weeks, was written in Sloane's own hand. He'd seen it enough times in her emails and corrections to recognize it. But the slight forward tilt, the specific curve of the R, he'd seen that somewhere else too. In a card pinned to the small memorial board outside the Crossbar HR office, a printed tribute to Diana Prell that included a handwritten note, still there after 3 years, because nobody had felt it was their place to take it down. The handwriting matched the card in the conference room in the small, specific way that a copied signature is never quite the same as the original. He put that together on a Wednesday afternoon, alone in the copy room, waiting for a document to finish printing. He didn't do anything with it. He just held it the way you hold something you've understood that you weren't supposed to understand yet, carefully and without making a sound. Gordon Mast had a style of concern that was entirely his own. He expressed it with information. He sent articles about leadership burnout, tagged with a simple FYI. He suggested half-day Fridays for the team, a recommendation that was both for the team and obviously about one specific member of it. He asked, in their one-on-ones, gentle questions about her workload that were phrased as practical and were actually personal, and Sloane answered the practical version and left the personal one alone. She had known Gordon for 4 years. She knew his tells. The articles were new, that was the tell. He was preparing a position. The question was what position, and whether he had taken it anywhere yet. In the 3rd week of June, she found out. It came through Richard Aldridge, the board member who had been on since year 3, and who called her twice a year for what he called a temperature check, which meant a 20-minute conversation where he took her temperature and told her what he was seeing from the board's perspective, which she appreciated even when she didn't like what he was saying. He called her on a Wednesday, and the temperature this time was different. Less a reading of the room and more the sound of someone who has heard something and is deciding how to approach it. He didn't say Gordon's name. He said, "I've been hearing some conversations about whether the company's governance structure is well positioned for the next phase of growth." He said, "Some board members have been in informal discussions about what a continuity framework might look like." He said, "I wanted to make sure you were aware that these conversations were happening." She thanked him. She said she appreciated his calling. She ended the call and sat in the office for a moment looking at the city, and thought about what it meant that Gordon had gone to board members before coming to her, and what it meant that Richard had called, and what the gap between those 2 data points revealed about how far along the conversation already was. She thought about what Diana would have done. Diana would have gone directly to Gordon, sat down across the table from him, and said, "I know what you're doing. Tell me what you're actually worried about." And she would have meant it, not as a trap, but as a genuine invitation to have the harder conversation instead of the one that was being managed around her. Sloane did not do that. She could have. She chose not to, because doing it would have revealed that Richard had called her, and she did not want to spend Gordon's remaining goodwill, which was real. Even now, on proving she had the information faster than he expected. She had the information. She would use it when she had decided what to build with it. What she built was the threshold presentation. The day she called Joel in to warn him not to involve himself in what came next was also the day she had the clearest understanding of what comes next was going to cost her. She had done the math. The board motion was likely to fail if she presented the threshold case well. She had 3 solid votes. Richard would almost certainly be a 4th, and the remaining 3 were persuadable. But almost certainly and persuadable were not the same as done, and the margin was narrower than she liked. And Gordon's memo was going to be thorough and well-intended and structurally hard to counter without looking defensive. She needed the board to see the company as growing forward. She needed the threshold presentation to not look like a reactive defense, but like the natural next move of a CEO who was ahead of where everyone else was looking. She worked on it in her office until nearly 11 most nights in October. She had always worked late. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that some nights, when the building was fully quiet and the lights had gone to minimal, she would pause from her screen and just sit in the silence with the city outside the window and the photograph on the sill. And she would think about the question she was in the process of answering, which was, "What is this place without you in it, Diana?" The answer was something, but not enough, which was both her fear and her reason. After she called Joel in and told him not to involve himself, she spent the next several days understanding that she had made a mistake. Not about the substance of what she'd said. The instruction had been correct. Don't involve yourself. Stay out of the board dynamics. That was right. The mistake was in what she hadn't said, which was, "I know why you told me. I know it cost you something. You did the right thing, and I am not going to say so in a way you can hold on to. And I am sorry for that in the way I am sorry for most things, which is privately and without showing you." She didn't say it. She was not yet the person who could say it. But she had started doing what she always did when she owed someone something she didn't know how to give them directly. She removed the obstacles. The parking validation, the updated access, the morning agenda. Small adjustments that said, in the practical language she was fluent in, "I see you. You're still here." The arrangement continues. She should have trusted the signal she was sending. She didn't. She panicked, which was the word she used for it 3 days later when she was honest with herself, and panicking had sent her to the wrong decision at exactly the wrong moment. The 2 weeks of his notice period were the most uncomfortable 2 weeks she had spent in 3 years, including the board motion and the hospital and the rehabilitation facility, and the specific terrible Tuesday when she had driven herself back to the Crossbar building for the first time after the accident and sat in the parking structure for 11 minutes, gripping the steering wheel with a hand that wasn't working as well as she needed it to before she went in. They were uncomfortable because he kept being good at the job. He kept showing up. He did the handover documentation for the external contractor with the same thoroughness he'd applied to everything else, which meant the documentation was excellent and also meant she kept being reminded that this person she'd just let go was exactly the person she'd said she needed him to be, which made her error more not less expensive the longer she looked at it. She waited until the last possible moment to not make the call she kept almost making. Then he was in the lobby on Monday morning. She came through the door and he was there, reading something on his phone, and it was so plainly a decision. Not an accident, not uncertainty, not someone who didn't know what else to do with a Monday morning. That she understood it for what it was. He had come back because leaving was not something he was willing to do, and he was giving her the option to acknowledge that without forcing her to say anything she wasn't ready to say. She told him about the north stairwell lights. She got in the elevator. At the 4th floor, she got out. At 8:15, his first work order update arrived. She held her phone for a moment. Then she set it down. She opened her laptop. She sent Patricia an email saying that the facility's restructuring had been put on hold pending a review of operational needs. Patricia responded with a brief acknowledgement and did not say anything else, which was what Patricia had spent 4 years perfecting. Sloan moved on to the day's first meeting. The stairwell lights came on. The building worked. The man in the building kept the building working. That was how it was settled. He also noticed the thing with her hand. It happened under specific conditions, high-stakes calls, board-adjacent meetings, the moments when the pressure in the room went up and she needed to remain composed in a way that cost her something. She would press her left palm flat against the armrest of her wheelchair, not gripping it, just pressing, with steady and even force for 3 or 4 seconds. Then she would release and continue. Nobody else noticed, because they were looking at her face, which never changed. Joel noticed because he was usually at the back of whatever room she was in and had the angle to see her hands. He did not know what it meant. He knew what it looked like someone testing whether something was there, like a person pressing against a door they'd been told was locked, not to force it, just to check. He filed it away with the other things he had begun to accumulate without intending to. The photograph facing the window, the handwriting on the card, the board call she'd told him about in the mechanical room, which she had never referenced again, as though it had escaped and she had retrieved it and was not planning on letting it out a second time. He went to his daughter's school play on a Friday in May. Maya was a rainstorm, which meant she had a cardboard cloud on her head and was responsible for making rain sounds at designated moments using a shaker instrument. She was deeply committed to the role. She shook the instrument with full sincerity. Joel sat in the third row and watched his 7-year-old be a rainstorm with complete seriousness, and felt something in his chest that had no name in English, but probably had one in some other language. The specific mixture of love and grief and gratitude that comes from watching your child be magnificent in a school gymnasium while you miss, very precisely, the person who would have been sitting next to you. He drove home. He made dinner. Maya told him she wanted to be a meteorologist when she grew up. He said that was a great choice. She said it was because she already knew how to be weather. He put her to bed. He sat in the kitchen for a while. He thought about Claire, who had been in the advocacy world, who had known companies like Crossbar from the policy side, who would have had strong opinions about accessibility tech, and probably also about the chair in the conference room. He thought about the $43 that were now $1,243, and the way money's presence changes the quality of your thoughts, gives them a longer horizon, lets you sleep to the end of a whole night instead of waking at 3 a.m. to run calculations. He went to sleep. The next day he went to work. Sloan asked him 2 questions about the upcoming vendor audit, and he answered both correctly. The wall was exactly where it had been, which was fine. He wasn't trying to move it. He was just there, in the same building, doing the same job, noticing the things that were his to notice and leaving alone the things that weren't. That was all. What Sloan Hargrove did not know in May was that Gordon Mast had begun to have conversations that he had not told her about. They were careful conversations, held in places that were not Crossbar, over coffee with a board member named Richard Aldridge, who had been on the board since year 3 and who trusted Gordon's judgment in the specific way that people trust the judgment of someone who has been consistently right about small things for 4 years. Over lunch, with a woman named Sandra Cho from the legal team, framed as routine compliance review, over email threads that used careful language, the kind that doesn't say what it means directly, but means it clearly to anyone who's reading between the lines. What Gordon was concerned about, and he was genuinely concerned, which was what made him dangerous in a way that a cynical actor never was Sloane's health, not the wheelchair. He understood the wheelchair the way he'd been told to understand it, as a fact of her life and not a limit on her capacity. What concerned him was the pressure she was under, the pace she kept, the fact that she had not taken a vacation day in 14 months, the reports from 2 members of the leadership team who had separately and independently mentioned to him that she seemed, in the specific language people used when they were worried about someone but didn't want to make an accusation, tired. Not tired the way anyone was tired at the end of a long quarter. Tired in a way that felt structural. Gordon Mast had spent his career keeping companies from making mistakes out of loyalty. The mistake he had seen most often was the one where nobody raised the difficult question because they cared too much about the person at the center to do it. He did not want to make that mistake. He was trying to be a good CFO, which meant thinking about the institution even when thinking about the institution was uncomfortable for the individual at its head. What he was not telling himself, because it was not the kind of thing Gordon Mast told himself, was that he had also had 2 dinners with representatives of a strategic buyer who had been circling Crossbar for 18 months. and that those dinners had planted a small, careful seed about what a transition of leadership might make possible in terms of a potential acquisition conversation, and that the seed was growing in a way he had not exactly chosen, but had also not exactly prevented. He drafted a memo in late May. He labeled it Governance and Leadership Continuity, a proactive review. He sent it to 3 board members before sending it to Sloan. He told himself this was because he wanted the idea to have traction before it became a conversation, so that Sloan wouldn't feel ambushed. He told himself he was protecting her from a worse surprise. He was not lying to himself exactly, but he was not being entirely honest either, which was the most common condition of people who make terrible decisions for good reasons. Joel found out about the memo on a Thursday morning in June, and he found out by accident, which was the most common way that important information traveled in organizations that believed they were more confidential than they were. He was in the facility's supply closet adjacent to the 4th floor conference room, replacing a lighting panel, when the ventilation duct that ran between the 2 spaces carried the sound of Gordon Mast's voice on a phone call, with a clarity that the building's architects had probably not intended. He wasn't trying to listen. He listened anyway. He heard Gordon say, "The memo should go to the full board by end of month. I need the 3 of you aligned before that." A pause. "She won't see it as support. That's why this has to come from the board first." Another pause. "She's not incapable." Nobody is saying that. We're saying that the structure around her is not sustainable, and that it's our job to address it before it becomes a crisis. Joel finished the lighting panel. He noted in his work order log that the panel had been replaced and that the ambient light level on the 4th floor should be rechecked in 2 weeks. He ate lunch. He thought about what he'd heard for 6 hours. He thought about what Patricia would do. He thought about what Claire would say, which was almost certainly tell her. He thought about the $43 and the $1,200 and the coat that didn't wrinkle. He thought about what was his business and what was not. At 5:30 p.m., when the building had mostly cleared, he knocked on the open door of Sloane's office. She looked up from her screen. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I don't know if it's my place. I heard it by accident." He paused. "Gordon Mast is going to the board before he tells you. There's a memo. He's calling it a continuity review." Sloane did not move. Her expression did not change. The room was very quiet. "How do you know this?" she said. He told her. The supply closet, the duct, the specifics of what he'd heard. He did not apologize for having overheard it or for telling her, because he didn't think either thing required an apology. When he finished, she looked at him for a long moment. The quality of that look was something he had not seen from her before. Not assessment, not acknowledgement. It was the look of someone who had just been given information they already suspected was true and had now been handed the proof, and was deciding how to carry it. "Thank you," she said. It came out differently from the usual administrative thank yous. Less transaction. More weight. He nodded. He started to leave. "Brennan?" He stopped. "This doesn't leave this room," she said. "And you don't involve yourself in what comes next." "Understood," he said. He left. He went home. He was back the next morning. What he did not know was that the conversation had not entirely gone the way he understood it to have gone. Because Sloane Hargrove did not experience it as gratitude. Or not only as gratitude. She experienced it as exposure. And exposure was the thing she had spent 3 years managing against. Someone in her building knew something about her company's board dynamics that she had not told them. Someone had seen her from a distance she hadn't authorized. And that someone had chosen to tell her, which meant they cared what happened to her, which meant they were already closer than she had permitted. She thought about this at 11 p.m., sitting at her desk with the city lights visible through the window and the photograph on the sill facing outward, the way it always did. She thought about Diana, who had never asked permission before getting close, who had shown up one day with opinions and kept coming back with more of them and never once waited to be authorized, who had saved Sloane a seat at every table she got to first, not because she was asked to, not because it was her job, but because she had decided Sloane deserved a seat, and that was that. She thought about the man in the hallway who showed up every morning, who fixed things before she knew they were broken, who had told her something difficult because he thought she should know it. She told herself it was just competence. She believed that mostly. She turned off the light and went home. The next day, she called him into her office and fired him. She didn't call it firing. She said his role was being restructured. She said the facility's function was being absorbed into an external management contract, effective in 2 weeks. She said he'd receive the standard severance. Her voice was precise, and she did not look at him directly when she said it, which was the first time she had ever not looked at him when she was talking to him, and if he noticed that. If he understood what that meant, he didn't show it. He said okay. He took his 2 weeks' notice and went back to work. She watched him on the camera system that evening, on the small monitor in the corner of her office that she almost never looked at, and she watched him organize his work orders for the handover with the same thoroughness he'd brought to everything else. And she thought she had made a mistake. Not about the vulnerability of having someone know her business, which was a real concern. She'd made a mistake about what kind of threat he was. He was not a threat. She had simply panicked, which was not something she did, and she had fired someone because she couldn't fire the feeling that had preceded the decision, and she would now have to deal with the fact that she'd done that. She did not call him back that night. She did not rescind the notice. She sat with the mistake the way Diana had always told her to sit with mistakes, fully without flinching, until you understand exactly what it cost you and exactly why you made it. Joel did not tell Maya that he'd been let go. He said the job situation was in transition. Maya, who was 7, accepted this with the unruffled confidence of someone who had been told by her father that things would work out, and had found in 6 years of data that this was approximately true. His last day was a Friday. He cleared out his workstation. He said goodbye to the people who'd gotten used to seeing him. Patricia gave him a look that was harder to read than her usual efficiency. Not pity, not apology, just the specific expression of someone who knew something wasn't right and had calculated that saying so wasn't her place. He drove home. He dropped Maya at his sister's. He drove back to the neighborhood, because Maya's school was 3 blocks from Crossbar and he didn't know yet where else to be. And he parked the car and sat there for 20 minutes and thought about the coat that didn't wrinkle, and the $43 that had become $1,200, and whether $1,200 was enough of a floor to stand on. He decided it was. On Monday morning, at 7:52 a.m., he was sitting in the Crossbar lobby when Sloane came through the front door. He was reading something on his phone. He was not pretending to be there for any particular reason. He was just there. She stopped. She looked at him. He looked up. They held that for a moment, 2 people in a lobby, one of whom had technically been terminated and one of whom had technically done the terminating, both of them fully aware of how this looked. Sloane turned toward the elevator. "The lights on the north stairwell have been intermittent," she said. "Start there." He put his phone away. He followed her into the elevator. Nothing was said. At the 4th floor, she got off. He went to the 5th. At 8:15, he sent his first work order update of the week. He was not rehired. There was no paperwork, no formal rescission, no conversation. The external contract that had supposedly been absorbing his role was never mentioned again. His access badge continued to work. He continued to do his job. That was how it was settled. Maya had been at Crossbar for the rest of the morning, and the morning revealed itself. This was the thing about children that adults perpetually forgot. They didn't stop being interesting simply because you'd stopped expecting them to be. Maya ate the snack bar Joel had packed for her at 11 o'clock with the focused efficiency of someone who took nutrition seriously. She asked the woman from the design team who walked by why her jacket was that color and was told it was cobalt. And Maya said cobalt was a good word because it sounded like what it was. She told Patricia, who brought her a cup of apple juice, that she was in 2nd grade and that her best subject was math even though her teacher thought it was art. And that both were true, but she liked being good at math because people didn't expect it. Patricia had looked at her over that, and then looked at Joel, and said nothing, which said quite a bit. Sloane, for her part, did not engage in extended conversation with Maya after the conference room moment. She had a full morning of meetings. But Joel noticed across the course of the day that she twice chose a route through the 2nd floor area where Maya was set up, That was not the most direct route to where she was going. He noticed this the way he noticed the morning reports and the Thursday appointments and the hand on the armrest, cataloging it without deciding what to do with it, waiting for the picture to develop. At noon, Maya produced from her backpack a set of highlighters in 12 colors and asked if she could use them to draw a map of the office. He said yes. She produced a map. It was geographically improbable but emotionally accurate. The biggest room on the map was the conference room with the chair, which she labeled the chair room, and the second biggest room was the break room, labeled coffee and snacks, and the smallest room was the server room, labeled loud machines, and the CEO's office was simply labeled Sloan, without a room border, just the name, as though the room and the person were the same thing. He folded the map and put it in his jacket pocket. After Maya left, his sister had come to collect her at 2 o'clock, pipe resolved. The office felt the way certain spaces feel after a 7-year-old has vacated them, slightly larger and noticeably quieter. The way a room is always quieter when the person in it, who asks the most honest questions, is no longer there to ask them. Sloan passed him in the hallway at 4:30. She stopped. "Your daughter asked me if my friend's chair was a ghost chair," she said. He looked at her. "She watches a lot of movies." She was not wrong. He looked at her. "Diana used to say that empty chairs were the most honest architecture," Sloan said, "that they showed you exactly where people chose not to be." A pause. "I don't think that's what she meant for me to do with it." She was looking at the middle distance, the way she looked when she was putting something in order. "I think she meant it as an observation, not an instruction." Another pause. It took a 7-year-old to clarify that. He did not say, "I've been thinking that for 6 months." He said, "She's perceptive." "She is," Sloan said. "And then she also told me that penguins can't actually fly. She believes they can if they try hard enough." That's optimistic. That's Maya. Sloan looked at him. The moment was brief and held something that neither of them acknowledged by name, because naming it would have required a conversation they were not quite ready to have. Then she moved on. He went back to his work orders. But she stopped at the door of her office and turned back. "The threshold presentation," she said. "I need someone to walk the space assessments, the physical structure, what works, what doesn't, what has been done by someone who read a compliance document, and what has been done by someone who understood what they were actually trying to achieve. I need that from a person who knows the difference." He looked at her. "That's what I do," he said. "I know," she said. "Can you start Thursday?" "I can start tomorrow," he said. She nodded. She went into her office. He stood in the hallway for a moment and understood that the thing had just shifted, in the way things shift when two people have been circling a decision for long enough and one of them finally says the thing clearly. What followed was 3 months of the most direct and productive collaboration either of them had experienced in a long time, which they also did not discuss. He walked spaces. 14 properties in the first month, hospitals, office buildings, schools, city facilities, and he came back from each with assessments that were specific, granular, and organized around a simple question that he'd been asking buildings for 10 years. What does this space say about who it thinks it's for? Sometimes the answer was clear from the door. Sometimes you had to get inside 3 or 4 rooms before you found the assumption that had been built into the bones of the place. The floor plan decision, or the counter height, or the single restroom that was technically compliant and practically unusable. He wrote it all down. He gave her the documents. She read them the way she read things she found useful, completely, without marking them up the first time, and then a second time with annotations. She sent back questions that were the kind of questions you ask when you have understood a thing and want to understand the next layer of it. He answered them. She incorporated the answers into the threshold business model, which was taking shape in her office in the particular way that Sloan built things, completely, rigorously, with every structural beam accounted for before the first wall went up. The business model was for a consulting and design arm that would move crossbar from software interface accessibility into the physical world, buildings and spaces assessed, redesigned, and renovated with the kind of specificity that compliance checklists could not produce, and that most accessibility consultants did not have the operational background to achieve. It was not a new idea. Sloan had identified the gap years earlier. What was new was the combination, her analytical framework and policy expertise, his operational and spatial knowledge. and 3 years of Crossbar's accumulated credibility in the disability tech space. Threshold Co. was not named until August. Before it was named, it was just a folder on her desktop called Space Project, which was her version of allowing something to exist before she was sure it deserved a name. He was in her office on the day she named it. He'd come in to walk her through the assessment findings for the fourth property, a city library in the Central District that had been renovated in 2018 by a contractor who had done everything the code required and nothing the building's users actually needed. He was explaining the specific issue with the branch desk, which had been lowered to a compliant height but positioned in a way that required navigating 2 fixed book displays to reach it, when she held up a hand. She was looking at her laptop screen. She typed something. She said, "Threshold." He stopped talking. "The entry point," she said. "The place where things change. Where inside and outside meet." She was still looking at her screen. Threshold Co. She looked up. "Does that work?" He thought about it. "That works," he said. She turned back to her screen. "Continue," she said. He continued. The branch desk, the 2 book displays, the simple rearrangement that would have cost $1,100 in 2018 and now required a facilities project to accomplish what should have been obvious to anyone who'd tried to navigate the space with a mobility aid. She listened with the focused attention she brought to everything that mattered and wrote 3 notes on her legal pad. The third note, he could see from across the desk, was the name of a city official she was going to call. She called the official the next morning. The meeting was scheduled. The conversation that would eventually become the municipal contract began, in a conference room with 6 city staffers and 1 CEO who had done her research and 1 facilities coordinator who had walked the buildings and knew exactly where every problem was and had already thought about how to solve each one. The meeting lasted 2 hours. On the drive back to Crossbar, he had driven because she was returning 2 calls during the trip, and she had simply gotten in when he pulled up. Another thing that had happened without being discussed. She said, "They're going to say yes." "I know," he said. "You're sure?" The deputy director kept looking at the floor plan annotations. She was already doing the math. A pause. "I was going to say the second official on the left." "Him too," Joel said. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people in a car after something that went well, which was a specific and underrated kind of quiet. "We build this correctly," she said, "and it's real." "It's already real," he said. She looked out the window at the city going by, the water visible for a moment between buildings, the October light doing the Pacific Northwest thing where it went gold and low and made everything look more significant than it was, or maybe exactly as significant as it was. He had lived here long enough to not be able to tell the difference anymore. "Yes," she said, after a moment. "I suppose it is." She called him into her office that evening at 6:30 when the building was quiet and the last of the team had left. Patricia had gone at 5:50. The cleaning crew didn't come until 7. It was as private as anything at Crossbar ever got. He sat down across from her desk. She was looking out the window at the city, which was doing what Seattle did in June, showing off. All blue sky and the kind of light that looked photographic, and was just Tuesday. The photograph on the windowsill was visible from where she sat, that angled face outward toward the glass. She didn't preface it. She just began, in the flat, precise way she had of delivering information that mattered, as though the evenness of her tone was the only protection she had left. "The accident was 3 years ago," she said. "December 15th. We had a deal closing, a partnership with a company in Tacoma that we'd been negotiating for 8 months. Diana and I were supposed to celebrate. We went to dinner. On the way back, on the bridge, the driver ran a red light. Broad impact. Diana's injuries were too severe. She was gone by the time the ambulance arrived. A beat. I was in the hospital for 11 days and in rehabilitation for 4 months. When I came out, the company was still there, because Diana had spent the 2 weeks before the accident building a contingency structure. And I have thought about that, the fact that she prepared for the possibility of losing herself and left me with something to come back to, every day since. Joel said nothing. "The chair," she said. Diana used to save me a seat at every meeting she got to first. She'd put a folded card, any paper she had, against the back of whatever chair was next to hers, with reserved written on it, because otherwise I'd end up at the wrong end of the table. She said she needed me next to her so she could read my reactions. She was still looking at the window. After she died, I bought a chair. I put the card on it. I don't know why I did that the first time. I know why I've kept doing it. It's because the last 3 years have felt like a table where the most important person didn't make it to the meeting, and having that seat there means I'm not pretending otherwise. She paused. Her voice had not changed register, but there was something different in the room now. The way a room feels different when someone has just said the truest thing they know. Nobody asks about it. I've never told anyone. The silence held. Outside, the ferry moved across Elliott Bay. 3 years for me, too, Joel said. She turned to look at him. He told her about Claire the same way she'd told him about Diana, without decoration, without narrative structure, just facts arranged in order. The aneurysm. The morning she hadn't been where she was supposed to be. The hospital. The 43 hours, and then the end of it. Maya, who was 4, and knew that something had changed, and did not understand yet what change of that magnitude felt like when it settled. He did not list his feelings. He described the events and let the events carry them. When he finished, they were both quiet. "Does it get easier?" she said. It was not a question she would have asked anyone else, which both of them understood. "It gets different," he said. "I don't think easier is the right word for what happens. You get better at carrying it. The weight doesn't change." She nodded, very slightly. She turned back to the window. He looked at the photograph on the sill. He could just make out 2 people in it, taken somewhere that had water in the background, 2 women laughing at something off camera. He didn't ask. She didn't explain. They sat in the office for another 10 minutes, mostly in silence, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had just handled something real without destroying each other in the process. He stood to leave. "The north stairwell light," she said. "One of the ballasts needs replacing, not just the bulb. The blinking pattern is the indicator." "I know," he said. "I ordered the part on Friday." She almost did something that was not quite a smile. Not quite. But almost. He went home. That was the confession scene. It was not moving, in the sentimental way of things designed to move you. It was just 2 people in a room at the end of a long day, telling each other the truth. The weeks after that were different in the specific way that things are different when a door has been opened and nobody has closed it again. It did not look like warmth from the outside. Sloan still corrected his reports when they had errors. She still moved through the building with the contained forward directional focus that her team had organized their working lives around. She still fired a vendor in July with the same precision and brevity she'd applied to the one in April. But there were small changes. She began copying him on facilities adjacent vendor communications, which meant he didn't have to go through Patricia for information that was relevant to his work. She answered his emails within 20 minutes, where before it had sometimes been 6 hours. Once in the break room, she told him the coffee order from Fieldwork had a standing option to add a second item, and that the account was on the company card, which was either an instruction about a work perk he hadn't known about or an invitation to get coffee, and he treated it as the former because that was simpler and she seemed to need things to be simple right now. He did not push. He had learned very early in his life that there was a category of people who would let you in if you waited, and a category of people who would let you in if you pushed, and that you had to know the difference, because pushing the first kind was how you ended up on the wrong side of a locked door you'd been about to walk through. Sloan Hargrove was entirely the first kind. So he waited. He fixed the lights. He managed the vendors. He showed up every morning. The thing that changed everything was 7 years old and arrived on a Friday morning in July, wearing red sneakers and carrying a backpack that was approximately 40% of her body mass. Joel's sister had been supposed to take Maya for the day. His sister had called at 7:30 with a burst pipe and a plumber who couldn't come until noon, and an apology that was entirely sincere and completely unhelpful. The after-school program didn't open until August. The only backup that existed was bringing Maya to work, which was not ideal, and also the only option available. He texted Patricia. Patricia texted back. She's welcome for the morning. Keep her out of the third floor open plan. Maya came in carrying the backpack and assessed Crossbar Innovations with the thoroughness of someone who took new environments seriously. She identified the water dispenser immediately and asked for a cup. She observed that the carpet on the second floor was the same color as her grandmother's house. She told Joel that the elevator button made a different sound than the one at their apartment building, specifically a more confident sound, and that she felt the same way about it. He set her up in the conference room off the second floor with a coloring book, a tablet loaded with educational games she had never once chosen over the coloring book, and explicit instructions: sit here. Don't bother people, don't open the door marked authorized entry, don't ask anyone for anything unless it was an emergency. What counts as an emergency? Maya said. Fire, medical, something is broken. What if I need a snack? That is not an emergency. What if I'm really hungry? Text me. What if Maya? Okay. He left her with the coloring book. He went to handle a plumbing issue on the fourth floor that bore some thematic resemblance to his sister's morning and took 35 minutes to resolve. When he came back downstairs, he found the conference room door open and Maya gone. He did not immediately panic. He walked down the hall, turned the corner, and found Maya in the large main conference room, sitting in the reserved chair. She had not climbed up or arranged herself in any particular way. She had simply sat down in the nearest chair, the way a 7-year-old sits down in chairs, entirely without ceremony. She was coloring in her book, which was now spread across the conference table, and she was humming something that was recognizable as a song from a TV show that she maintained was educational. Joel's stomach dropped. He started toward her to move her, and then stopped, because Sloane had just wheeled through the other door. They all three became very still. Maya looked up. She looked at Sloane. She looked at the chair she was sitting in. She looked at the small folded card that had fallen to the floor when she sat down, which she had picked up and placed on the table without reading it, because she was 7 and the handwriting was small. Hi, said Maya. Sloane looked at her, then at Joel, then back at Maya. Hello, Sloane said. Her voice was exactly what it always was, controlled, precise, giving nothing away. She wheeled to the head of the table in preparation for the 9 o'clock leadership check-in that was still 20 minutes away, which was why nobody else was there. I'm Maya, Maya said. I'm not supposed to be here. I mean, in the building. I am supposed to be at my grandma's, but there was a plumbing thing, and I know who you are, Sloane said. Joel mentioned you. Maya's eyebrows went up. She looked at Joel with the expression of someone who has just discovered relevant information. Dad said you were his boss. I am. He said you were good at your job. He's correct. He also said you have high standards, which he said like it was a good thing, but he said it the same way he talks about the dentist. Maya considered. No offense. Something happened on Sloane's face. It came and went very quickly, and Joel would have missed it if he hadn't been watching for it. A flicker of something that in another face would have become a laugh, but in Sloane's face simply registered briefly and then was composed back to neutral, which was its own kind of laugh. None taken, Sloane said. Maya looked around the room. She looked at the chair she was sitting in. She looked at the folded card on the table. She picked it up and read it, with the careful sounding out of someone who was solidly in the reading stage but took the responsibility seriously. Reserved, she said. Is this your chair? No, Sloane said. Whose is it? A pause. A friend's. Maya nodded, processing this with the gravity it deserved. Is she coming? Sloane was quiet for a moment. No, she said. She's not. Maya looked at her, and then at the chair, and then back at Sloane. She had the specific face of a 7-year-old who has understood something and is deciding whether to say it out loud. Does she know you're saving it for her? Maya asked. The question landed in the room the way only honest questions land, without fanfare, without intention, and with far more weight than anything deliberate could have had. Joel started to say something. Sloane held up one hand briefly in the exact gesture that meant, don't. She looked at Maya. She knows, Sloane said. Quietly, Maya nodded, satisfied. Okay, she picked up her crayon. You should put a picture on the chair. so people know it's for someone special. My mom's picture is on the bookshelf at home, and that's how everyone knows she's important even though she's not there. The room was very, very quiet. Your mother isn't there, Sloane said, after a moment. She died when I was 4. But Dad says she's still here, Maya patted her chest, in the specific location. So I guess that counts. She went back to coloring. I'm coloring a horse. Want to see? She held up the coloring book without waiting for an answer. The horse was enthusiastically colored in 3 different shades of blue. That's a blue horse, Sloane said. Blue is a good color for horses. I wouldn't know. It is. Trust me. Maya set the book back down. I like your building. The elevator sounds confident. Joel caught Sloane's eye over Maya's head. He expected nothing. What he got was something he had never seen on Sloane Hargrove's face. The specific expression of someone who has been entirely disarmed by a 7-year-old and is deciding how to feel about that. He moved to get Maya. Bug, come on. She's fine, Sloane said. The words came out before she could organize them into anything more calculated. She looked at Maya, who had gone back to the blue horse. She can stay for the prep. Joel looked at her. She was already looking at her notes. The matter was closed. Maya stayed. She colored the horse through the entire pre-meeting setup, and when the leadership team began to file in, she climbed down from the chair and came to stand next to Joel at the back of the room, watching with the concentrated observation of someone taking in new information. The reserved chair was empty again, the reserved card back against its back where Patricia had replaced it. Maya stood in the doorway and watched, and did not say a single word for 45 minutes, which was a personal record. On the way out of the building, holding Joel's hand on the sidewalk, she said, Dad, yeah, your boss is sad. He looked at her. What makes you say that? The way she looks at the chair. Maya adjusted her backpack straps. The same way you look at Mom's picture sometimes. She thought about it. She should let someone real sit in the chair soon. I think her friend would want that. He didn't answer. He thought about what Maya had said to Sloane, and what Sloane had not answered, and the photograph on the windowsill, and the 41 board calls without a voice in his ear handing him the gift. Yeah, he said. Finally. I think you're right. What changed after that day was not dramatic. It was incremental, in the way that real things change, a degree at a time, barely visible until you looked back and measured the distance. Sloane began copying him on emails that had no operational component. Things he had no business reason to see. Things that were simply part of running the company. She began stopping in the doorway of whatever room he was working in and saying things that were not questions. Observations, small things she'd noticed. A story about a vendor. Once, he answered the same way. Briefly, accurately, and without pushing for more. She told him, in August, about the idea she'd been developing for 6 months. A pivot in Crossbar's service model. A direct consulting and design arm that would work with clients on physical space accessibility rather than just software interface. She'd been calling it Threshold, internally, to herself. She laid it out the way she laid out everything, with precision, with data, with the specific vocabulary of someone who has thought about something for a long time and now knows exactly where the load-bearing pieces are. What do you need to make it work? He said. Someone who knows buildings, she said, who understands what accessibility means in a physical space from the inside out, not from a compliance checklist. He looked at her. She was looking at her notes. That's what I do, he said. I know, she said. There was a pause that was not empty. So you'd want me to transition into that work, he said. Not a question, just confirming the thing she had just told him without saying it. If you're willing, she said. He was. He said so. She nodded as though the thing was settled, which it was. Which it had been, probably since the server room in March. Threshold Co. was incorporated in September. It was a subsidiary of Crossbar, not a separate entity. She had thought carefully about the structure and the tax implications and the staffing model, and presented the full operational plan to the board in October, 2 weeks before Gordon Mass' memo was scheduled to reach the full board committee. She beat him there by 14 days, which was its own kind of answer. What Joel knew about Gordon Mast's governance memo, Sloane had eventually told him. Not all of it, but enough. She had told him the way she told him most important things now, plainly, after she'd already decided what to do about it, so that the telling was information rather than a request for help. She was not asking him to help. She was telling him something that mattered, which was what you did for people who had earned the right to know the things that mattered. He understood the difference. He received the information the way it was offered and said, "What do you need from me?" She said, "To keep doing what you're doing." He said, "That's easy." She said, "I know," which was the closest she had ever come to a compliment, and he didn't make anything of it, because making things of things was how you ruined them. The board meeting was the first Tuesday of November. Sloane had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, with data, with structure, with the threshold business case fully built, and the revenue projections verified by 2 separate analysts. She had also, for the first time in 3 years, prepared for it without pretending that Diana's voice was in her ear. She had sat in her office the Sunday evening before and read her own notes, and she'd realized, somewhere around 9 o'clock, that the gift Diana used to give her, the one fact, the one angle she'd missed, she had been finding herself for months now. Not from a voice in her memory, but from conversations with someone who asked good questions and then waited for the answer and didn't need the answer to be about him. She had thought about that for a while. Then she had gone to bed. She'd slept well, which was its own kind of answer. The meeting was at 9 o'clock. Gordon had requested the early slot, which meant he was presenting first, which meant he'd gotten there before her, which meant he would have the room before she did. She understood tactics. She let it be. She arrived at 8:52. She went to her usual position at the head of the table. She looked at the reserved chair. She did not look at it the way she usually did, confirming its presence, confirming the card. She just looked at it, briefly, the way you look at something that has been in your life for a long time and that you are beginning to understand differently. She looked away. The board filed in. Gordon presented first. His presentation was careful, thorough, and framed with genuine care. He was not a malicious man, which made what he was doing harder to argue against than if he had been. He talked about leadership continuity. He talked about sustainable management structures. He talked about her health with the euphemistic delicacy of someone who meant well and was managing the language carefully. The board listened with the politely attentive expressions of people who had received a pre-brief and already had opinions. She was 2 slides into her counter-presentation when the door opened. Joel Brennan walked in. He was not expected. He was not on the agenda. He had never been in a board meeting at Crossbar in his life. He was wearing the charcoal wool jacket that she would later realize he wore to things that mattered. And he scanned the room for a seat with the calm efficiency of someone who knows what he's looking for and is not going to make a production of finding it. The only available seat in the packed room was to her right. He sat down in the reserved chair, calmly, without ceremony. The reserved card tipped off the back and fell to the floor, and nobody moved to pick it up. He picked it up, folded it once, and set it on the table in front of him. Then he looked at Sloane and nodded once, the particular nod of someone who is ready. She looked at him. Something happened that was very small and completely visible and entirely inexplicable to everyone else in the room. It was not a smile. It was not warmth. It was simply acknowledgement. Recognition, the expression of someone who has been keeping a seat and has just found the person who was always supposed to be in it, and is refusing to make a speech about it, because the whole point of keeping a seat is that when the right person shows up, they simply sit down. She turned back to the board. She presented for 41 minutes. It was the clearest, most precisely argued presentation she had ever given. She led with the revenue trend line. Gordon hadn't anticipated that. She watched the committee chair, who was sleep-deprived and distracted, track it with visible relief. She laid out the threshold case with the structure of something that had been pressure-tested from every angle. She answered every anticipated objection before it was raised, with data she had prepared for specific concerns she'd correctly predicted specific board members would have. She closed with the operational projections for the next 3 years and sat back and was quiet. The board voted at 11:30. The governance continuity motion failed 7-3. Gordon was quiet on the way out. He said, in the hallway, to no one in particular, she's not always right about everything. A pause. But she was right about this. He resigned from the CFO role 6 weeks later, citing personal reasons, and went to work at a wealth management firm in Bellevue. He sent a brief, respectful email on his last day. Sloane answered it with 2 sentences. Neither of those sentences was "I told you so," which was the most dignified thing she had ever done, and she had done many dignified things. She asked Joel afterward, in the parking structure, in the gray November light, why he had come. He said, "You needed someone to sit there." She said, "That chair was reserved." He said, "I know." A beat. She looked at the folded card in his hand. He still had it. "She would have liked you," Sloane said. "Diana? Yeah? She would have found you deeply irritating and then asked you not to leave." Joel thought about that. Sounds about right. Sloane reached out and took the card from him. She held it for a moment, looking at the handwriting, her own handwriting, modeled after someone else's. Carried forward for 3 years in the specific way that love carries things forward when people can't. She folded it once more and put it in her jacket pocket. "Don't read too much into that," she said. "I'm not reading anything into anything," he said. Good, he drove home. He picked up Maya, who immediately asked how the day went. He said it went well. She said she knew it would. He said of course she did. She said, "Is your boss less sad?" He said, "I think she's getting there." Maya considered this and said, "Good, because she has a very nice building, and it would be a waste to be sad in a nice building." He said that was probably true. She said obviously it was true. The physical therapy room at the clinic in Capitol Hill had the particular quality of clinical spaces that were trying not to feel clinical. A few plants, a wall with motivational text that was inoffensive enough not to offend, and not interesting enough to read. Sloane's usual driver had called in sick that morning. Joel had driven her, and she had neither thanked him in advance nor told him he didn't need to wait, which meant she'd registered that he was going to wait regardless, and had chosen not to waste the energy disagreeing. He sat in the waiting room for 50 minutes. He did not look at his phone. He looked at the wall, and the plants, and the text he couldn't quite read from his angle. And he thought about the November board meeting, and the chair and the folded card she had put in her pocket, and not replaced on the reserved chair since. The chair was still in the conference room. The card was gone. He didn't know what that meant. He had a theory. He kept the theory to himself. Dr. Reyes came to the doorway of the waiting area at the 50-minute mark and said, "She said you could come in." He went in. The therapy room was brighter than the waiting area, big windows on one wall. Sloane was at the parallel bars, a setup he had not known about, had not asked about, had understood was there from the Thursday appointments and the clinic's name on her calendar, and the way she pressed her palm against the armrest sometimes, testing, she was standing. Both hands on the bars, weight forward, entirely concentrated. She did not look at him when he came in. He stood near the door and said nothing. She took a step. Her right foot moved forward with the specific deliberateness of something relearned, something rebuilt from near nothing. Then, her left. She was at the far end of the parallel bars. She stood there for a moment. "Breathing again?" Joel said. She turned, carefully, and looked at him. There was something on her face that he had never seen there before. Not triumph, not relief. Just the look of someone who has kept going when going was extraordinarily difficult, and is standing, for the first time in a long time, without anything between themselves and the ground except their own body. Again, she said. She walked back. He watched. He did not move toward her. He did not offer his hand or his arm or anything she hadn't asked for. He was simply there, in the room while she did the hardest thing she had done in 3 years, and that was what she had needed him to be. Dr. Reyes noted the progress in her file. 2 complete passes at the parallel bars, unassisted, with stability. She closed the file and said she'd see Sloane Thursday. Sloane nodded. She sat down in her wheelchair and took a moment to be still, the way she was still after things that cost her something. On the way out of the clinic, she said, "You didn't say anything." "What was there to say?" he said. She didn't answer, which was its own answer. He drove her back to Crossbar. She went upstairs. He went to his office and updated his work orders and sent his afternoon report. At 5 o'clock, he walked by the main conference room and looked in through the glass. The reserved chair was in its place. The reserved card was gone. The chair was just a chair. He stood there for a moment. Then he went home. The following March, Threshold Co. landed its first major public contract, a partnership with the City of Seattle to assess and retrofit 14 municipal buildings for accessibility compliance beyond the minimum code requirements. It was the kind of work Diana Prell had talked about in their second year, when she'd said, "The software is what gets you in the room. The buildings are what changes people's lives." Sloan had remembered that. She had built the thing Diana would have built, with someone Diana would have liked, toward an outcome Diana would have recognized. The contract signing was on a Thursday. There was a small ceremony, city officials, a photographer, some people from the legal team, the Threshold staff. Sloan signed the paperwork with her left hand, which she had been using more and more these days. Joel stood near the back of the room, which was where he stood at official events, because the official events were hers and his role was operational. He watched her sign. He watched the city official shake her hand. He watched her look, briefly, at the empty chair to her right at the signing table. They'd set up a row of chairs, and one was empty at the end, and nobody had put a reserved card on it. And it was just an empty chair, the way empty chairs were just empty chairs most of the time. She signed her name on the contract. She did not look at the chair again. She turned to the room and said something gracious and brief about what the work meant and who it was for. She was not performing. She was just a CEO who ran a good company and was now doing more good work, and she said so plainly, without poetry, which was more moving than poetry would have been. After, when most people had left, she wheeled to where Joel was helping stack the leftover programs near the door. "She would have been here for this," Sloan said. He looked at her. She was looking at the space the event had occupied, the chairs being put back, the city officials collecting their things. "She built what this grew from," he said. Yes, a pause. "I used to think about her every day. Now I think about her differently. Less like a missing piece and more like a place I came from. Something that's in the structure." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm still not sure that's better." "I think it is," he said. She looked at him. It was the look she'd given him the morning in the parking structure, the one that was neither warm nor cold but simply honest, and he'd learned by now to receive honesty from Sloan Hargrove the same way she offered it, directly, without deflecting it into something more comfortable. "You've been here a year," she said. "About that. You should probably receive a formal performance review. Probably, I'll have Patricia schedule it." "Okay, a beat." She turned to go. He went back to stacking programs. "Brennan," he stopped. "The review is going to go well," she said. Forewarning, he did not smile where she could see it. He waited until she had wheeled out of the room. Then he smiled. "The reserved chair is still in Conference Room A on the 6th floor of Crossbar Innovations. The reserved card is gone. Nobody has replaced it. The chair has been there long enough now that it belongs to the room the way certain things belong to rooms. Not because anyone decided it should stay, but because its absence would make the room feel wrong. And nobody who knows the room wants to feel that. Sometimes people sit in it, not always. Sometimes it's empty, and that's fine too." Here is what Sloan Hargrove was not doing for 3 years, even though it looked like she was. She was not grieving. She had grieved. What she was doing was something harder to name, and maybe more important, she was keeping a record. She was saying, with a chair and a card and 3 years of consistent practice, this person was here. This seat mattered. "I am not going to pretend the table was never full. There is a kind of faithfulness that doesn't look like love from the outside, and doesn't need to. It looks like a folded card against the back of a chair. It looks like showing up." Joel Brennan had no idea, when he sat down in that chair at the board meeting in November, that he was the first person to sit there in 3 years. He had not planned the moment. He had simply walked into a room where there was one seat available and sat in it, which is how most important things happen, not by grand intention, but by ordinary continuation, by showing up when it would have been easier not to, and letting the situation decide what comes next. He was not a rescue. He was not a transformation. He was a person who showed up, who asked accurate questions, who fixed what was broken before anyone asked him to, who sat very still in a physical therapy clinic while someone he cared about relearned what her body could do. He did not take credit for any of it. He did not build his identity around being the one who stayed. He stayed because leaving was not something he had any interest in, and that was the whole of it. She was not saved by him. She was not changed by him, not in the fundamental way that would imply she had been insufficient before. What she was, by the time March came and the ink dried on the city contract, was more completely herself than she had been in 3 years. Not because someone had unlocked her, but because she had been making progress the whole time. And a year of having someone in the same building who was paying genuine attention had simply meant she did not have to hold the whole thing alone. That is a different thing than rescue. It is smaller and more honest, and it is what actually changes lives. The chair in conference room A is just a chair now. Anyone can sit in it. That is the point. She kept it reserved for someone she had lost, because she could not yet make room for someone new. Because grief does that, it occupies space even after it's finished, holds the form of the person who's gone like a shape pressed into warm wax. She kept the chair because she was not ready to not keep the chair. And then, when she was ready, she didn't say so. She didn't make an announcement. She just left the card out and let the chair be a chair. Sometimes the most important things you do don't feel like decisions. They feel like finally stopping doing the thing that was never going to last forever anyway. There is a 7-year-old in this story who understood all of it before any of the adults did, which is entirely typical and also correct. The people closest to the truth in any story are almost always the ones who haven't yet learned to be careful with it. Maya Brennan sat in a chair that no one had sat in for 3 years and asked 2 questions. Does she know you're saving it? And why don't you put a picture on it so people know it's for someone special? And both of those questions, asked without strategy or agenda, by a person whose only credential was being 7 years old and not afraid of direct questions, opened 2 doors that no adult in that building had managed to open in 3 years of trying. That is also part of the story. The part that is hardest to write and easiest to understand, sometimes what breaks through is not the persistent presence, not the correctly handled crisis, not the governance motion voted down, or the parallel bars walked, or the contract signed. Sometimes it is a child with red sneakers and a coloring book who sits in the forbidden chair and says, "Whose is it? And does she know you're saving it?" And something that has been held for a very long time can finally be set down. The 3 years are the story. What happens after the 3 years is not a new story. It is the same story, continuing. In a building where the elevator sounds confident and the plants on the 6th floor are real, and a chair that used to be reserved is now just a chair that sits to the right of the head of a long conference table, available to whoever gets there first, which is the oldest gesture of belonging there is. Someone saved you a seat. Someone is always saving you a seat, if you know where to look. The question is whether you're willing to sit down,